Gina Raimondo thought she had the perfect setup. Standing at the podium during a high-profile congressional hearing on transportation infrastructure, the usually polished Secretary of Transportation spotted an opportunity to make a clever quip. Representative Jonathan Roumie had just finished a passionate speech about funding disparities in his Texas district, and Raimondo, ever the pragmatic administrator, couldn't resist. "Well, Representative Roumie," she said with that confident, no-nonsense smile, "perhaps if your district's infrastructure proposals aligned more closely with established economic and engineering priorities, we'd have more common ground for investment." The room went silent. Cameras captured every second. What Raimondo intended as a lighthearted jab at less fiscally prudent spending was about to become her biggest public relations nightmare in years. Within minutes, the clip would be everywhere, and Jonathan Roumie was about to show millions of Americans exactly why you should never underestimate a voice for the vulnerable from Texas. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss how this political showdown unfolds. Trust me, you're going to want to see what happens next. Gina Raimondo, former governor, accomplished venture capitalist, and Secretary of Transportation, known for her measured pragmatism and intellectual approach. At 51, she'd built her reputation on being unflappable under pressure. Her communication skills had made her a Democratic Party favorite, someone who could handle tough questions with ease, always pivoting to data and economic rationale. But today, that confidence might have been her downfall. Raimondo had been testifying before the House Transportation Committee about the administration's infrastructure spending. She'd fielded dozens of questions from Republicans challenging every dollar spent. She was in her element, or so she thought. The hearing room was packed with reporters, C-SPAN cameras rolling, and millions watching live online. Jonathan Roumie, the earnest 49-year-old freshman representative from Texas, had only been in Congress for 2 years, but he'd already made a name for himself as someone who didn't back down from advocating for the marginalized. A former community organizer with a deep faith-based background, he'd spent years fighting for underserved communities on the ground before bringing that same heartfelt energy to Capitol Hill. Roumie represented Texas's 30th district, which included parts of Dallas and its suburbs. His constituents were predominantly working-class Black and Hispanic families who'd been fighting for basic infrastructure improvements for decades. Crumbling roads, inadequate public transit, and failing bridges weren't just talking points for him. They were daily realities for the people who elected him. The hearing had been relatively routine until Roumie took his 5 minutes to question. He'd come prepared with charts, photographs, and statistics showing how his district had been consistently underfunded compared to wealthier areas. His voice rose with genuine moral urgency as he described families who couldn't get to work because bus routes had been cut, seniors who couldn't access medical care because the nearest hospital was miles away with no reliable transportation. "Secretary Raimondo," he'd said, holding up a photo of a pothole so large it looked like a small crater. "This is what infrastructure looks like in my district. We've been asking for help for years, and we keep getting told there's no money, but somehow there's always money for projects in districts where people already have working roads." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd grown up in communities like the ones he now represented. This wasn't political theater for Roumie. It was personal, a plea for basic human dignity. What neither politician realized in that moment was how much this exchange would reveal about American politics in 2024. Raimondo represented the pragmatic, economically minded wing of the Democratic Party, the kind of politician comfortable discussing ROI and infrastructure metrics. Roumie embodied the grassroots moral energy that had been reshaping the party from the bottom up, emphasizing human needs over pure economic models. The cameras were rolling, social media was watching, and millions of Americans were about to witness what happens when detached pragmatism meets principled advocacy head-on. Raimondo had been sailing through the hearing with the confidence of someone who'd mastered the art of congressional testimony. Republican committee members had thrown their usual talking points at her: government waste, bureaucratic inefficiency, liberal spending priorities. Each attack was met with her signature combination of economic expertise and media-trained deflection. She cited transportation studies, rattled off infrastructure statistics, and made her critics look unprepared with detailed responses that sounded authoritative, even when they didn't fully address the questions asked. The hearing room had settled into the familiar rhythm of political theater. Republicans would attack, Raimondo would defend with technocratic precision, and Democrats would offer friendly questions that allowed her to highlight administration achievements. It was exactly the kind of environment where her Ivy League-trained intellect and cabinet-level briefings gave her every advantage. When Roumie's turn came, Raimondo initially treated him like just another freshman member looking to score political points for the folks back home. Her staff had briefed her on the day's participants, but their research on Roumie had focused on surface-level details: his freshman status, his community organizing background, his district's demographics. What they hadn't conveyed was his reputation as a methodical preparation machine who treated every public appearance like a moral argument he intended to win. The transportation secretary had dealt with dozens of representatives trying to get attention for their districts over the past 2 years. Most followed predictable patterns: a few pointed questions, a request for specific funding, maybe a photo opportunity afterward. Raimondo's team had developed efficient strategies for handling these routine exchanges while giving the appearance of genuine engagement. They'd underestimated that Roumie had been studying those same strategies and preparing countermeasures. "Secretary Raimondo," Roumie continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of profound concern, "I want to show you something that your department's statistics don't capture." He held up his phone, displaying a video that had been circulating on social media from his district. "This is Mrs. Dorothy Johnson. She's 73 years old, a retired school cafeteria worker who raised 5 children as a single mother and now lives on a fixed income of $20,200 a month. Last Tuesday, she missed her dialysis appointment, an appointment that literally keeps her alive, because bus number 47 on the Elm Street route broke down for the 4th time this month." Roumie's voice grew stronger as he continued, the personal connection evident in every word. "There's no backup transportation in her neighborhood because your department's efficiency metrics determine that having reserved buses for low-income routes isn't cost-effective. The next scheduled bus wasn't due for 3 hours. So Mrs. Johnson, who weighs maybe 110 pounds and uses a walking cane, had to walk 2 miles in 95 degrees Texas heat to get to the dialysis clinic that keeps her kidneys functioning." He paused, letting the image sink in for everyone watching. By the time she arrived, she'd missed her appointment window. The clinic couldn't fit her in until the next day, which meant her body went an extra 24 hours without the treatment she needs 3 times a week to stay alive. All because we can't keep a bus running in a neighborhood where people can't afford backup transportation. The room had grown completely silent. Even staff members who'd been shuffling papers and checking phones stopped to listen. This wasn't political theater. This was someone describing the life or death consequences of bureaucratic decisions. Mrs. Johnson isn't asking for fancy bike lanes with artistic sculptures or high-tech traffic management systems with smartphone integration. She just wants a bus that starts in the morning and doesn't break down before she gets to her medical appointments. But apparently, according to your department's economic priorities, that's not considered essential infrastructure. Raimondo's expression remained carefully neutral, the kind of practiced composure that years of media training had taught her to maintain. But viewers could see her checking her notes more frequently, perhaps looking for the perfect policy response that would deflect from the human story Roumie was telling. She was still treating this like a typical congressional hearing where technical expertise and economic rationale could overcome emotional appeals, not understanding that Roumie was speaking from lived experience about his constituents' daily struggles for survival. "Representative Roumie, Raimondo replied, her tone measured but slightly condescending. "I understand your concerns about transportation equity. We've allocated significant resources to urban transit systems, and your district has received federal funding through various programs." She began rattling off statistics about grant programs and federal initiatives, the kind of technical details that usually satisfied committee members. But Roumie wasn't backing down. "With respect, Secretary Raimondo, I'm not asking for a policy lecture. I'm asking why my constituents can't get to work, can't get to the doctor, can't get to the grocery store. These aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real people with real problems." This is when Raimondo made her crucial error. Instead of acknowledging the human cost of infrastructure failures, she decided to go for what she thought would be a clever political point based on her administrative philosophy. Her media training had taught her to pivot difficult questions toward broader policy discussions and economic viability. But this time, her instinct to deflect would cost her dearly. "Well, Representative Roumie," she said, leaning forward slightly with that administrator's smile, Perhaps if your district's infrastructure proposals aligned more closely with established economic and engineering priorities, we would have a clearer path for investment. The room went dead silent. Committee members looked up from their phones. Staff members behind the witness table froze. Television cameras captured every face in the room as the implications of Raimondo's comment sank in. She just dismissed the concerns of a representative speaking for a disadvantaged district in Texas as not meeting her department's economic and engineering priorities. The implication was clear. Their basic human needs weren't legitimate within her framework of what constitutes valuable infrastructure. For a moment, nobody moved. Roumie sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, but a deep resolve began to set in his eyes. Committee Chair, Representative Maria Gonzalez, looked shocked. Even Republican members, who'd been ready to attack Raimondo themselves, seemed taken aback by the casual dismissal of a colleague's concerns. Raimondo, realizing her mistake, tried to backtrack. "What I meant was," she began, but Roumie raised his hand. "No, Secretary Raimondo, I heard exactly what you meant." His voice was calm, but everyone in the room could sense the storm coming. Social media exploded within seconds. Clips of Raimondo's comment were already being shared with captions like, "Did she really just say that?" and "The pragmatism is showing." The hashtag economic priorities versus human needs started trending almost immediately. What Raimondo didn't understand was that she just handed Roumie the perfect opening. As a community advocate, he'd spent years dealing with exactly this kind of institutional detachment. He'd seen countless government officials wave away legitimate concerns from communities of color with polite, data-driven condescension. But this time, he had a national platform, live cameras, and a Secretary of Transportation who just revealed more about her priorities than she intended. Roumie had grown up in neighborhoods where politicians promised change during election season and then forgot about their commitments once in office. He'd represented communities who'd been told their problems weren't really problems or that their needs weren't economically viable. Now he had 5 minutes left in his questioning time, and he was about to use every second to deliver a lesson in consequence that Raimondo would never forget. Jonathan Roumie leaned back in his chair, a slight, almost solemn smile crossing his face. Anyone who knew him recognized that expression. It was the same look he'd worn in community meetings before delivering heartfelt appeals that left local officials speechless. "Economic and engineering priorities," he repeated, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and growing righteous anger. "Secretary Raimondo, I want to make sure I understand what you just said. You're suggesting that my constituents' need for working buses, safe roads, and reliable bridges doesn't align with your established economic and engineering priorities?" Raimondo, sensing she was in trouble, tried to clarify. "Representative Roumie, I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I was referring to some of the broader definitions of infrastructure that have been proposed and the need for fiscal prudence." "No, Madam Secretary," Roumie interrupted, his voice sharp with conviction. "There's no misunderstanding here. You just told a national television audience that the transportation needs of my predominantly Black and Hispanic district are somehow less legitimate because they don't fit your narrow definition of economic priority. You called our basic needs for functioning public transit financially unsound." Roumie reached for a folder that his staff had prepared, but this wasn't just any standard briefing materials. These were documents he'd personally compiled during months of research, staying up late after committee meetings to analyze transportation department databases that most members of Congress never bothered to examine. His background as a community advocate had taught him that winning required more than passion. It demanded overwhelming evidence presented with moral clarity. "Let me illuminate for you what actual infrastructure needs look like, Secretary Raimondo. This is a map of transportation spending in Texas over the past 10 years. He held up a large chart that showed clear disparities in federal funding across different congressional districts. The visual was striking. Wealthy districts appeared in deep green, indicating high per capita funding, while districts like his appeared in concerning shades of red. But Roumie wasn't finished with just one chart. He'd brought an entire presentation worth of evidence, each piece carefully selected to build an irrefutable case. His advocacy training had taught him to anticipate every possible administrative counterargument and prepare responses that would leave his opponent with nowhere to hide. Districts with median household incomes over $75,000 received an average of $847 per capita in federal transportation funding over the past decade. Districts like mine, with median household incomes under $45,000, received an average of $312 per capita. But here's what makes this even more outrageous. My constituents are 3 times more likely to depend on public transportation than residents of those wealthy districts. He pulled out another document, his voice gaining strength as he continued. This analysis shows that districts with the highest public transit ridership consistently receive the lowest per capita federal investment. Meanwhile, districts where most people drive luxury cars to work get the most money for infrastructure they don't even need. Raimondo shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This wasn't the kind of detailed preparation she'd expected from a freshman representative, and it certainly wasn't the type of questioning her media training had prepared her to handle. Her usual strategies of pivoting to broader policy discussions and citing departmental achievements were useless against someone who'd clearly done more homework than her own staff and who framed the data as a moral failing. The Transportation Secretary's team, sitting behind her, frantically flipped through their briefing materials, looking for counter statistics they could pass forward. But Roumie had anticipated this response too. Every number he cited came with citations. Every claim was backed by multiple sources, and every argument was structured to withstand the kind of bureaucratic pushback she knew was coming. Representative Roumie, Raimondo began, trying to regain control of the exchange. Transportation funding is distributed through a complex formula that takes into account multiple factors, including population density, existing infrastructure, and— "Stop right there," Roumie said, holding up his hand. "Don't you dare lecture me about transportation formulas. I've spent the last 2 years studying every line item in your department's budget. I know exactly how these decisions get made, and I know who gets prioritized." He pulled out another document. "This is interesting. Your department approved $45 million for a bike path expansion project in a district where the median household income is $89,000. Beautiful project. I'm sure those families will enjoy their weekend rides. But you denied our request for $8 million to replace buses that are over 15 years old and break down 3 times a week." The committee room was completely silent except for the sound of cameras clicking and phones buzzing with social media notifications. Roumie was just getting started. As a community advocate, he'd perfected the art of presenting airtight cases for justice, and he was about to demonstrate that skill on national television. You want to talk about aligning with economic and engineering priorities? Let me tell you what's truly misaligned, Secretary Raimondo. Last year, your department classified a $23 million parking garage in suburban Connecticut as essential transportation infrastructure. But somehow, bus stops in my district where families wait in 100-degree heat don't qualify for federal shade structure funding because they're considered amenities, not infrastructure. Raimondo was now visibly uncomfortable, adjusting her tie and looking toward her staff for help. But Roumie wasn't finished. Here's another misaligned priority. Your department spent $67 million on smart traffic management systems for a district where the biggest traffic problem is which luxury car to drive to work. Meanwhile, my district has traffic lights that haven't worked properly in 3 years, causing 2 fatal accidents that could have been prevented with basic maintenance. Roumie's voice began to rise, carrying years of frustration at watching her communities be systematically ignored. You sit there in your well-tailored suit with your Ivy League education and your cabinet-level salary, and you have the audacity to suggest that my constituents' needs aren't legitimate transportation priorities. You think it's prudent to dismiss the struggles of working families who just want to get to their jobs without their buses breaking down? The camera zoomed in on Raimondo's face. The confident, media-trained politician who'd started this hearing was nowhere to be seen. In her place sat someone who'd clearly underestimated his opponent and was paying the price. "But here's what really gets me, Secretary Raimondo," Roumie continued, pulling out his final piece of evidence. "While you're making dismissive comments about my district's priorities, I did some research on your former state of Rhode Island." Raimondo's expression changed instantly. She knew where this was going. During your time as governor, Rhode Island received $34 million in federal transportation funding for a specific port modernization project. That's a significant investment per resident. My district, with twice the population and 3 times the poverty rate, receives a fraction of that in comparable per-resident infrastructure investment. Can you explain why your former constituents deserve more federal transportation investment than mine, based on your own economic and engineering priorities? The room erupted. Republican committee members who'd been planning to attack Raimondo themselves found themselves watching a masterclass in political destruction. Democratic members looked uncomfortable. caught between supporting a cabinet member from their own party and defending their colleagues' legitimate points. Raimondo tried one last time to salvage the situation. Representative Roumie, I think you're conflating different types of funding streams in different time periods. No, I'm not, Roumie shot back immediately. I'm pointing out exactly what every person watching this hearing can see. You believe some communities deserve better transportation than others, and you're willing to dismiss the communities that get left behind under the guise of economic and engineering priorities. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years fighting for the underrepresented. You dismiss my constituents' needs as not aligning with your department's economic framework, but the only thing that's truly misaligned here is your department's ability to find money for pet projects in wealthy districts while claiming there's nothing left for working families who actually depend on public transportation to survive. While Roumie was systematically dismantling Raimondo's credibility, social media was exploding. The hashtag #economic priorities vs human needs had been joined by #Roumie educates Raimondo and #moral infrastructure. Video clips of the exchange were racking up millions of views across platforms. Progressive activists who'd been critical of Raimondo's more centrist, economically driven approach found new ammunition. Conservative commentators, despite disagreeing with Roumie on most issues, found themselves impressed by his preparation and passion. Independent voters watching the hearing saw a clear contrast between someone fighting for his constituents with moral clarity and someone who seemed out of touch with working families' struggles. As Roumie's time expired, he delivered his closing statement with the precision of a prosecutor making a final argument to a jury, but with the heartfelt plea of a pastor speaking for his flock. Secretary Raimondo, you came here today expecting to handle another routine congressional hearing. You thought you could dismiss my concerns with a pragmatic retort and move on to the next question, but you miscalculated. My constituents sent me here to speak for them, not to be silent when their basic human needs get reduced to a spreadsheet entry by people who've never had to worry about whether the bus will show up. He gathered his papers, his voice carrying finality. The next time you want to make dismissive comments about a community's infrastructure needs, remember this moment. Remember that behind every funding request you deem not aligned with economic priorities are real families trying to build better lives. And remember that some of us won't stay quiet when our communities get disrespected. The hearing room remained silent as Committee Chair Representative Gonzalez called for a brief recess. Raimondo sat at the witness table, no longer the confident cabinet secretary who'd walked in that morning. She'd been systematically outmaneuvered by someone she'd underestimated, and the entire country had watched it happen live. Within 30 minutes of the hearing's conclusion, clips of the Roumie-Raimondo exchange were trending on every major social media platform. The original video of Raimondo's economic and engineering priorities comment had been viewed over 2 million times on Twitter alone, while longer clips of Roumie's systematic response were spreading even faster. Political journalists scrambled to provide context and analysis. Cable news shows cleared their afternoon programming to discuss what was already being called one of the most devastating congressional takedowns in recent memory. The administration's communications team found themselves in damage control mode. Press secretary statements about misunderstandings and taken out of context fell flat as more people watched the full exchange and saw the clear dismissiveness in Raimondo's initial comment. The hashtag economic priorities versus human needs took on a life of its own as users began sharing their own stories of infrastructure neglect in their communities. Photos of broken bus stops, dangerous intersections, and crumbling roads flooded social media, all tagged with Raimondo's phrase. A particularly viral thread from a transit worker in Detroit detailed how bus breakdowns in predominantly Black neighborhoods were treated as routine maintenance issues, while similar problems in wealthier areas received emergency response. The thread ended with, apparently wanting working buses is not an economically viable priority. Progressive activists found new energy in Roumie's performance. Organizations that had been critical of moderate Democrats' approach to infrastructure funding used the hearing as evidence that more aggressive, morally driven advocates were needed in Congress. Internet culture moved quickly to turn the exchange into shareable content. Memes featuring Raimondo's surprised expression during Roumie's questioning spread rapidly. One popular format showed her confident, pre-hearing face next to her stunned, mid-hearing expression with captions like, "When you try to dismiss someone who actually did their homework and has a moral compass." TikTok creators began using Roumie's "Let me illuminate for you" line as an audio clip for videos about various topics, turning his phrase into a broader symbol of informed, principled pushback against condescending authority figures. The creativity of the response ironically highlighted the disconnect between Raimondo's dismissive comment and the real innovation happening in communities that were finding ways to solve transportation problems despite lack of federal support. Democratic leadership found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Raimondo was a rising star in the party and a key cabinet member known for her economic acumen, but Roumie was quickly becoming a hero to the party's progressive base and a powerful voice for social justice. Internal discussions about how to handle the situation revealed deeper tensions about the party's direction and priorities. Progressive Democrats rallied around Roumie's performance. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what it looks like when someone comes to Congress to fight for their constituents with moral clarity, not to make friends with the establishment. Transportation equity isn't an economic priority spreadsheet entry, it's basic human dignity." More moderate Democrats tried to frame the exchange as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, but their efforts were undermined by the clear video evidence of Raimondo's dismissive tone and Roumie's substantive, empathetic response. As word of the confrontation spread through the Capitol building, other members of Congress began weighing in with reactions that revealed the broader political implications of the exchange. Progressive Democrats who had been looking for someone to challenge the administration's more moderate approach to infrastructure funding suddenly found their champion in Roumie's methodical takedown of Raimondo. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was among the first to respond, tweeting within an hour of the hearing's conclusion, "This is what it looks like when someone comes to Congress to fight for their constituents, not to make friends with the establishment. Transportation equity isn't a spreadsheet entry, it's basic human dignity." Other members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus quickly followed suit, with Representative Pramila Jayapal adding her own statement. Secretary Raimondo's comments today revealed the disconnect between this administration's rhetoric about equity and their actual economic priorities. Congressman Roumie showed us what real advocacy looks like. But the response wasn't limited to progressives. Several moderate Democrats, including those who had previously supported Raimondo's political career, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending a colleague against a member of their own party's cabinet. Representative Hakeem Jeffries, typically careful about intra-party conflicts, issued a measured statement calling for continued dialogue about ensuring all communities receive fair transportation investment, emphasizing the human element alongside economic considerations. Even some Republicans, despite their opposition to increased federal spending, found themselves impressed by Roumie's preparation and passionate, morally driven argument. Representative Chip Roy, not known for praising Democratic colleagues, acknowledged on social media that, at least someone in Congress is holding this administration accountable for their misplaced economic priorities. Even if I disagree with the proposed solutions, the bipartisan recognition of Roumie's performance, albeit for different reasons, highlighted how effectively he had framed the issue around competence and moral conviction rather than partisan talking points. Raimondo's department initially tried to minimize the controversy with standard political non-statements about productive dialogue and continuing to work with all stakeholders. But as the story gained in momentum, they were forced to provide more substantive responses. A follow-up statement attempted to clarify Raimondo's comment and outline the department's commitment to holistic transportation equity and sound economic investments. However, the statement was widely criticized as too little, too late, and for failing to address Roumie's specific funding disparities data and the moral implications of her dismissal. Career transportation officials within the department privately acknowledged that Roumie had raised legitimate concerns about funding formulas and the prioritization of economic models over direct human need. Some welcomed the attention to issues they'd been trying to address for years, even if it came at their secretary's expense. The hearing exchange highlighted several important trends in American politics and governance. Roumie's methodical destruction of Raimondo's position demonstrated how thorough preparation combined with profound moral clarity could overcome institutional advantages. His success showed that newer members of Congress could challenge established figures by doing their homework and fighting for their constituents with an unshakable sense of purpose. The contrast between Raimondo's technocratic, economically driven approach and Roumie's passionate, human-centered advocacy reflected broader debates about how politicians should communicate with the public. While Raimondo's measured, pragmatic style had worked in previous contexts, it appeared out of touch when confronted with stories of real hardship and moral injustice. The incident showed how quickly political moments could be amplified and contextualized through social media. Traditional political communication strategies that relied on controlling the narrative proved inadequate in an environment where unedited video could spread instantly. Roumie's ability to speak authentically about his constituents' experiences and frame them as moral imperatives highlighted the importance of having representatives who understand the communities they serve. His lived experience with transportation challenges, coupled with his deep empathy, gave him credibility that no amount of policy expertise could match. The exchange fundamentally altered the trajectory of both politicians' careers, but its impact extended far beyond their individual futures. For Raimondo, the hearing marked the beginning of a more complicated relationship with progressive voters and communities of color who had already harbored doubts about her ability to understand their experiences beyond economic metrics. Her political ambitions, which many political observers assumed remained alive, faced new scrutiny about her electability in diverse coalitions. Transportation industry insiders noted that her effectiveness as secretary could be permanently diminished if she became seen as too detached from the constituencies most dependent on public transportation. Some Democratic donors privately expressed concerns about her political future, with several major fundraisers quietly shifting their attention to other rising stars in the party. The incident became a case study in how a single moment could derail carefully laid political plans. Within the transportation department itself, career civil servants found themselves dealing with the fallout from their secretary's misstep. Some welcomed the increased attention to transportation equity issues they'd been trying to address for years, even if it came at Raimondo's expense. Others worried that the controversy would make it harder to build bipartisan support for infrastructure projects that required Republican votes in Congress. For Roumie, the performance established him as a rising star in the progressive movement and validated his approach of combining passionate advocacy rooted in moral conviction with meticulous preparation. Fundraising for his re-election campaign surged beyond anything his team had projected, with small-dollar donations pouring in from across the country. Progressive organizations that had been looking for new champions after some disappointing losses began courting him as a potential leader for future policy fights. Speaking invitations poured in from universities, advocacy groups, and democratic organizations nationwide. His staff found themselves fielding requests for interviews from national media outlets that had previously ignored the freshman representative from Texas. The transformation from relative unknown to progressive icon happened with stunning speed, demonstrating how viral moments could reshape political careers in the social media age. But Roumie's success also brought new pressures and expectations. Progressive activists began looking to him as a spokesperson for transportation equity issues nationwide, while Republican opponents started viewing him as a more significant threat worthy of their attention and opposition research. His every statement would now be scrutinized more closely, and his future performances would be measured against the impossibly high standard he'd set during the Raimondo hearing. The confrontation also validated the strategy of electing more diverse candidates who could bring different, human-centered perspectives to congressional hearings and policy debates. Political consultants noted that Roumie's authentic connection to transportation challenges and his ability to frame them as moral issues gave him credibility that no amount of policy expertise could match. His success inspired other candidates with similar backgrounds to run for office, potentially reshaping the composition of future congressional classes. The exchange refocused national attention on transportation equity issues that had been overshadowed by broader infrastructure debates. Community organizations in underserved areas found new platforms to discuss their long-standing concerns about funding disparities, now framed not just as economic oversights, but as moral failures. Policy researchers began examining the data Roumie had presented during the hearing, with several independent analyses confirming his basic assertions about funding inequities. This validation further strengthened his position and weakened attempts to dismiss his critique as partisan politics. Transportation advocates used the moment to push for reforms to federal funding formulas that had historically disadvantaged low-income communities and communities of color, emphasizing a reevaluation of how economic priorities are defined. The Raimondo-Roumie confrontation became a case study in political communication and the dangers of underestimating opponents. Political science professors began using the exchange as an example of how preparation, passion, and moral authenticity could overcome institutional advantages and detached pragmatism. The incident also demonstrated the continued power of congressional hearings as moments of political accountability, even in an era of partisan division and media fragmentation. Political journalists reflected on their own role in covering the exchange. Many acknowledged that they had initially underestimated both the significance of Raimondo's comment and the sophistication of Roumie's response. The incident sparked broader discussions about how media coverage of congressional hearings often focused on partisan conflict or economic debates rather than substantive policy debates deeply rooted in human experience. Roumie's data-driven, morally charged critique provided a model for how representatives could use their questioning time more effectively. As the dust settled from the immediate controversy, the long-term implications became clearer. The exchange had shifted the dynamics of transportation policy debates, elevated discussions of equity and infrastructure spending to a moral plane, and established new standards for congressional oversight. For millions of Americans who relied on public transportation, Roumie's defense of their needs provided hope that their concerns were finally being heard at the highest levels of government. His promise to continue fighting for transportation equity resonated far beyond his district's boundaries. The confrontation also served as a warning to other officials that dismissive attitudes masked by economic rationalizations toward constituents' needs would face increasingly sophisticated challenges from representatives who came to Congress to fight for human dignity rather than fit into administrative frameworks. This showdown between Gina Raimondo and Jonathan Roumie proves that in politics, preparation infused with moral purpose beats detached pragmatism every time. Roumie didn't just defend his constituents. He schooled a cabinet secretary on live television and showed America what real representation looks like. If you enjoyed watching this political masterclass unfold, smash that like button and subscribe for more breakdowns of the moments that change everything in American politics. What other political figures do you think need the Jonathan Roumie treatment? Let us know in the comments below.